Hello, hello! Welcome back to my kitchen. I'm Terry. I am the Shieldmaiden in the kitchen. And today I have a very historic recipe for you, and I'm doing it in honor of my friend Chris, who is finding himself landing in Scotland today for a long-awaited trip. And this is a recipe that's very much something you will find all over Scotland as a sort of traditional food, although it didn't originate there. It's been around for bazillions of years. But I'm talking about the humble oat cake. And this is also something that I'm going to bring Vikings into as well, of course, because Vikings are my thing, being a shield maiden and all. And it's something that they knew of course, in their world. But this is a recipe that I found actually in my friend Ao's house when I was staying there in Iceland just a couple of months ago. And he had this medieval cookbook, and it also had some kind of modern twists on medieval recipes. And so I'm going to adapt and do the modern version here. So we can talk a little bit about some of the variations and where this all came from, but just to give you an idea of the particular recipe that I'm going to use, you can take a look at the ingredients that I've got here. It's pretty simple stuff. We're going to cream some butter and sugar and then add some wet ingredients and some spices and then some dry ingredients, including the humble oats, and pretty much then bake it. And that will be it. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start putting this together. What I have here is half a cup or 1 stick of unsalted butter that has been softened. I just softened it a bit in the microwave. And I'm going to put it in my stand mixer. And this will get creamed with 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar that has been loosely packed. So put that in there, get our attachment on, our paddle attachment, and give that just a little bit of a whirl to soften it up. Typically what you're going to find with oat cakes is that it's really simple, especially the farther back in the Middle Ages and ancient world that you go, because of the access that they would have had to various types of ingredients, like the type of fat that they're going to use as far as animal fat goes, maybe butter like I'm using, or other forms of lard. Sometimes there's not going to be any spices in it at all. It's literally going to be just a basic cake that has the oats, maybe a little bit of flour and some salt. So, maybe even what you would kind of call hardtack, or this kind of biscuit that is pretty dense and hard, that people would have had to use as takeaway food, basically, something that's easily portable, but also just easy to make. And then also, with the spices and stuff, there's going to be, various access to that kind of stuff in the Middle Ages, depending on where you lived. Of course, we know a lot of the exploration that begins in the 15th century, which is well after the Viking Age, was in regard to accessing some of that stuff in various parts of the world. So sometimes the recipes that you'll find online, if you just Google oatcakes, they're going to be very simple, and sometimes they're going to have, a lot of other ingredients that may or may not have been accessible at all to a lot of people in the Middle Ages. So the sugar is probably a good place to start with that, because creaming the butter and the sugar together, well, of course, cane sugar is something that doesn't really become prevalent in Europe until after the Age of Exploration, again, beginning in like the 15th century. And those of you who've watched my channel for a while know that I specialize in the Viking Age, and the Viking Age, roughly speaking, is like the mid-8th century to around the year kind of 1100 or so. So if we're talking about Vikings proper, we're going to say they're not going to have access to this kind of sugar. As a matter of fact, the sugar, the sweetener that they would use primarily would be honey. And that would be, if they could get a hold of it, which in some places in Scandinavia, they had bees and stuff, of course, and raised them, and would have had access, but not everybody would have had easy access to it. So again, sometimes this is going to be a little bit of a savory kind of biscuit cake thing, and sometimes you can make it a little bit sweeter depending on where you were. It's not until really actually in the Viking Age proper, like maybe around the 9th century or so, that you even start to see much cane sugar production, but mostly always in the south of Europe, in southern Italy, and of course in southern Spain, brought there by Arabs, as the Islamic Empire spread through those parts of the world. But it needs to be in that kind of place because of the temperature. I mean, it needs, sugarcane needs a lot of water, and it needs a very warm temperature in order to grow properly. So that means Scandinavia is pretty much out as far as any widespread cultivation of sugar. So again, for Vikings, it would be honey if they were going to make this a sweet kind of biscuit. So, all right, so we've creamed our sugar and we've got the butter in there as well. Now we're going to finish adding the other wet ingredients, which basically is just one large egg, which of course they would have had access to various types of eggs, whether chicken eggs for sure, or maybe other types of fowl as well. And 1 teaspoon of vanilla. That would have been almost impossible for them to have gotten a hold of very much, if at all, for most people. Very expensive. All right, that's vanilla's in there, the egg is in there. And again, I mean, the vanilla, even to this day, right? I mean, a lot of you know, if you're going to talk about vanilla extract that I just used, or if you're going to use like vanilla bean and vanilla seeds, these things are very expensive, even still to this day, because it only grows in particular places. And so it's not widely known, and certainly wouldn't have been to Northern Europeans back in that time. All right, now we have 2 spices here for this recipe that I'm going to add. One is ginger and the other is cinnamon. And we're going to do just a half teaspoon of each. My hair is wild today, getting in my face. I have to manage this better, I suppose. All right, so half a teaspoon of ginger. And then also half a teaspoon of cinnamon. So mix those in. And again, you know, with the spices, a lot of times maybe it's not even going to have any spice to it at all, or very minimal spices, because a lot of people wouldn't have had access to this kind of stuff, depending on where you lived in the Middle Ages. And for Vikings, I mean, we know they travel very far and wide, and they do a lot of trading, including in places like Southern Europe and in what is now the Middle East and so forth. So they're going to be in areas where this stuff is being traded, but you know, how much of it they're going to be able to get a hold of at any point in time, how valuable it was to them, we don't really know. Some of you, if you've watched my channel for a while, I mean, you know that part of the Viking Age, they are essentially functionally illiterate from a modern standpoint. It's an oral culture for at least the first couple centuries. Until Christianity comes in. And so we don't have like written cookbooks from the Viking Age to know, you know, specifically what recipes were like and what they used or preferred to use. We have to extrapolate and kind of guesstimate based on the various areas in Scandinavia and what we know grew there well, and also because of the archaeology that has been done up to this point. There's definitely ways to identify foodstuffs, residues of foodstuffs, and see what we know that they were able to cultivate and that they used pretty widely. And we definitely know oats were one of those things. Although there is some information out there about the fact that potentially oats may have been used, specifically in Denmark, in the southern part of Scandinavia, more for animal consumption rather than people consumption. So they're feeding the oats to their animals, their cattle and so forth, versus using it a lot for themselves for human consumption. But in other parts of Scandinavia, we definitely know the oats are being grown and they're being used to make things like porridges, and also drinks as well, oat beer and things like that, or barley as well for that, of course. But this kind of grain cultivation was definitely happening, and also even happening as far west in Scandinavia as Iceland. So they are familiar with it, but again, like the various spices and stuff that they would have had to add to it, you know, that's going to vary depending on trade patterns and things that they may or may not have had or cared about all that much. But we're going to do kind of a spicy little one here as far as, you know, with the cinnamon particularly, but also the ginger as well will add a strong flavor. Now we'll finish adding the rest of the dry ingredients. So we have here 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder. And we'll have just a pinch of salt and 1 cup of rolled oats. And lastly, 1.5 cups of just all-purpose unbleached flour. So wheat flour, they definitely would have had access to some of that. Now I mentioned I'm making this in honor of my buddy Chris, and if you've watched my channel also previously, you may have seen our other video that we did together. So if you want to take a look at Chris in action, we did a video called Historians Do Haggis. So we were still kind of in the Scotland mode at that point in time. It's a place that Chris has traveled to a few times now, and I've been there once last year, just almost a year ago now. And so we decided to honor Scotland and historic food and make a video about haggis. So hopefully, if you haven't seen it, you'll check that out. But Chris is definitely something of a foodie, so I'm glad to make this recipe today in honor of him. All right, so let's mix that dry ingredient in there. And of course, it's going to be a dense mixture, but we want to kind of bring it all together so that we can kind of smash it together. And then it will need to sit in the refrigerator for about an hour to chill before we're able to easily roll it out. All right, that looks pretty good. You can kind of see that it's very much a dense mixture. Maybe get my paddle off of there. All right, there we go. All right, look at that, clumping up very nicely. Kind of bring it together. All right, and so what we'll do is we'll pat that into just a couple of rounds so that we can put it into some plastic wrap or, like a Ziploc bag or something, plastic bag, and put it in the refrigerator for about 60 minutes. And then we'll see about rolling it out and getting ready to bake. Alrighty, so now let's check and see if it's chilled for long enough and see if we can get it rolled out and start the baking process. I put the discs in the fridge for 60 minutes, and I've got a couple of these so you can see the size. I don't know, what is that? Probably like 5-6 inches across, something like that. And yeah, it looks like it's dense and chilled enough to be able to roll it out. Also a little bit pliable so that we can work with it and keep it together. The butter makes it nice and moist so that if it cracks and breaks apart, then you can also just easily, kind of squish it back together, almost like rolling out a chilled pie crust dough. This rolls out to 1/4 of an inch thickness. And then once you get it rolled out to that thickness, which is, I don't know, that looks about right, eyeballing it there, then you take a cookie cutter or a biscuit cutter. So this one is about 3 inches across, and you'll see I've got, it's kind of fancy, I guess. It's got a fluted edge. That wasn't intentional. I don't really need oatcakes to be fancy. As a matter of fact, oatcakes are probably like the least fancy kind of biscuit you can make almost, at least as far as their history goes. This is very basic food. And I have, also a plain one as well. If you don't have one of these, you can also just use something very simple, like take a drinking glass if you have one that, maybe has that kind of circumference to it, and just, upside down and use it. Because of the butter that's in there, again, it's soft, so it's not going to be too difficult to get it to push through. And so there you go, right? And I've got my prepared pan here with a little bit of parchment. The recipe actually doesn't say to, prepare the pan that way or to grease it or anything like that. So I'm imagining you don't really need to do it, but I'm just out of habit. I kind of do it with parchment when I'm baking things like this or cookies and things, because it just, things don't stick if they were prone to, but also it just kind of makes cleaning up the pan a little bit easier, quicker at the end of everything. And then we will bake these in a 350 Fahrenheit oven, or about 180 Celsius. And then they'll be hopefully about, cooked through and golden and crispy once about 20 minutes have passed. We'll see, because you're experimenting with me today, because truth be told, I have not made this recipe yet. I brought it home with me, as I mentioned, from Iceland, but it's been sitting on my counter waiting for me to get to it. And again, since my friend Chris went to Scotland today, this one's for him. So we'll bake these for 20 minutes and then we'll see what they look like. Okay, 20 minutes have passed, and so now we're going to check and see what we've got. Looks pretty good. Yeah, there we go. Okay. You can see a little bit of darkening around the edges, and so that's what we're looking for, because it's still a little bit, springy, a little bit slightly moist in the middle, but it's got kind of a crispy edge to it. So again, that was 20 minutes at 350 Fahrenheit. So remove those onto a wire rack so that they can cool. Alright, so let's see what we got here. Set that aside for a second. And I want to taste this, even though it's going to be hot. Probably won't taste as good as it will maybe a little bit later as it cools down. Okay, definitely got some sweetness there because of the 3/4 cups of brown sugar, but not too sweet. So I think this would be more typical for an oat cake, because it is something that can be used, as a dessert, like a cookie kind of thing, but also it can be savory as well and not quite as sweet. But I would recommend, sometimes I've seen in recipes where they talk about using them to sandwich things in. So you could, spread with some jam or honey or something and then sandwich the two of them together. This particular recipe actually has a variation where they made a paste out of pine nuts and then used that as a spread to sandwich in between. So again, it's pretty versatile and can go a few different ways. So, all right. Well, I think this is a good experiment. I like these. I would make these again. And, if you like them, then please remember to like and share and subscribe. Especially send the video out if you think that there's anybody else who might be interested in what I'm doing here. I will go ahead, as I usually do, and post this recipe in the description. But as I mentioned before, oatcakes are such a common thing, and they've been around for literally thousands of years. And so there's lots of variations in the types of recipe mixtures that you'll find. So if you go and Google or otherwise look up oatcakes, you're going to find a lot of stuff out there that you can try, and hopefully you'll find something that suits your taste. But so also, I just wanted to let you know as well that if you're interested in my history musings that I usually do here, I started a new Substack channel, and so you can check out some of my writing and some other things that I'm doing over there. I'll also have some links back here to my cooking, but I've got a lot of different things going on, and have been lucky to find some other creative avenues for what I'm doing. And this one is just happened to be to mixing cooking and history, but I also do a lot of teaching and writing and stuff about history as well. Various periods of time, but of course Viking stuff for sure, because that's my main deal. And I also have a podcast with my co-host CJ Adrian. Some of you know about this, but if you want to check it out, you can see some clips and shorts on our YouTube channel, which you can find just Vikingology Podcast. And so that's Vikingology, Vikingology, the art and science of the Viking Age. And we also have a separate Substack channel as well, where we're doing writing and other things. So if you want something that's more Viking specific, similar to what I'm doing here, but minus the cooking part, then feel free to go ahead and check that out as well. We've had a lot of great interviews with leading scholars in the field, and we're going to continue with that going forward. And I'll put the links to all of that stuff in the description. So anyway, that's it for me today. Have a great day. Sjamst!